Surrounded by crispy autumn leaves, an angel overlooks a citadel from the mountainside. The mountain being Mount Perdition, and the planet that this citadel belonged to was named Gallifrey. The disgraced guardian of the drylands silently screaming behind her stone hands, peeping at the peoples of her planet without blinking, looking through her hands that were placed in front of her face. A child would often visit her, and although the child could not hear the angel would often think back to her past, as if she was telling her tale to the boy. The boy sat there as memories began to channel through the angel's mind, presenting themselves to her as they began to fade in and out of existence. They were weak, and to survive, she would have to feast on the lives of others. Could she bring herself to do that, she asked herself. Her story was a story like any other tragedy. At least that is what she remembers within her mind. The eyes of a monster plague her mind as she continues to think back. Thinking back to the days of Rassilon and their friendship, travelling the stars and being an adventurer, now locked in one place for eternity. Rassilon was a heartbroken, grief-stricken old man at the time, still mourning the loss of his daughter. Omega tried to comfort him, but there was nothing he could say. Rassilon channeled his grief into his work, trying to create a better Gallifrey. His visions conflicted with that of his friends, and the woman could do nothing but support him in this time. It was when he started a war with a race named the Gorgons that the Time Lords realised what a better Gallifrey was in Rassilon's eyes, and where the planet was heading. The Gorgons visited Gallifrey using a talisman of sorts, a device that allowed them to traverse dimensions. After their defeat and entrapment in another universe, via Omega's ingenuity, they would have to create a new one that would enable them to travel between their homeworld and one in this universe that is more suitable, a primitive planet named Earth. That thought didn't worry Rassilon, as most of the Gorgons would be dying by then, and the affairs of other worlds need not concern him. What did concern Rassilon was their first visit to this universe. They wore veils to cover their repulsive appearances, that had the power to petrify creatures within hours. And Time Lords were no exception. It wasn't long before a war began to brew between the Time Lords and the Gorgons. Key Gallifreyan individuals, such as Slan Jr. and Pondrex the Chancellor, reduced to stone statues that now stand in burial grounds amongst the dead, much like this angel in her graveyard on Mount Perdition, for that is where she now remains. Rassilon intended to resolve this conflict as he always did, by starting further conflicts, and with that entire Gallifreyan armies were turned to stone. The angel remembers the day that Rassilon was informed of the news. This wouldn't deter him from trying again and again, but as predicted by literally everyone other than him, they would fail in their attempts to genocide the Gorgons. Only one Time Lord stood up to Rassilon, an old friend of his. Not that this would change her eventual fate, because anyone who stood up to Rassilon usually ended up within a shallow grave. Or even worse. This did not deter the woman, who spoke with pride. She then came up with a solution that would be the beginning of the end of this war, and her. She insisted that they should try to harness the power of the Gorgons, use their powers against them, to turn their armies into stone, rather than watching them turn Gallifreyan graduates from the university forced to fight and die in a war they didn't understand into stone. Rassilon smiled. For any idea given by this Time Lord in these dark times in Gallifreyan history, Rassilon would be infamous for it in Gallifrey's many futures, as if it was his idea. That is what the history books on Gallifrey want you to believe, and that they did. The war was swiftly won by the Time Lords, as Rassilon charged into battle alongside his many armies, and gave them mirrors that reflected the beams of blue light aimed towards them. The Gorgons retreated. They were trying to find a planet to occupy in this universe, but it wasn't long before Omega and his fleet managed to catch up to them, and with that, the Gorgons found themselves falling into another universe, unfamiliar territory for them to eventually make their own. All but one. But Rassilon wasn't done with the Gorgons as of yet, and was inspired by their attributes. Initially he thought of the unfathomable weapons he could utilize this power to create, but then his mind went to crime and punishment. It wasn't long before the Gorgon found herself strapped to a table, with their veil tied onto their face. Rassilon grabbed a scalpel, and the Gorgon let out a scream that awoke most of Gallifrey. After experimenting with her genetics, Rassilon closed her up. He didn't find the answer he was looking for, but realised that for now, the answer was right in front of him, and strapped onto the table. He washed the blood off his hands, and walked towards the balcony. He looked towards Gallifrey's horizon, alongside his old friend that stood up to him earlier. His old friend saw beauty, and focused on the majestic moon named Pazithi, but Rassilon focused on the power he could harness out there. If the Gorgons could hold such power, then perhaps they could too. He signalled towards the two guards, who stood by the door, and they placed a bag over his old friend's head. They then dragged her towards a dimly lit grey room. She doesn't remember much of what happened in there, or what Rassilon was saying, but all she remembers were the eyes of the Gorgon. She could feel her flesh turning to stone, as she found her eyes locking with that of the Gorgon's, unable to blink, unable to look away, as her skin was slowly replaced by stone. She could feel every second of it, as she tried to move her hands but couldn't. It was then that the stone cemented itself into her eye sockets. Her entire body was now nothing but stone. A punishment that Rassilon was yet to truly harness for himself, but with the help of a scientific advisor that stood in the shadows, one day in the future he would utilize the Gorgon's power for himself as a twisted punishment. And not only that, but he would utilize it within his very own masterpiece, the game of Rassilon. Until then, the Gorgon would be locked away and kept in chains, a loneliness that the now angel would come to understand. It was then that she could feel the wings etching out of her back. She screamed, but nobody could hear her. It was only when someone blinked that she found herself continuing her scream. And with every moment, every blink led to it continuing. It was as if she was completely paralysed when looked at. A cruel existence. Rassilon often came to visit her, used to talk to her, and discuss their experiments in time sensitivity and immortality. They were desperate to find the answer, to live forever, such as her. He knew from experience that it was a curse, but he was deluded. Rassilon thought they could obtain the power of said curse and control it. He had nothing left to lose in his view, after losing his family and everything that gave him happiness. The only thing he had left was his kingdom, his people, and his throne. The ultimate goal that he found himself fixating on was to lead Gallifrey forever. Rassilon's visits grew shorter and shorter, thus so did his temper. He eventually let her arms free, and decided to feed her for the first time. Rassilon got his guards to rummage through the low streets of Gallifrey, a location on Gallifrey infamous for its poverty. They were on the lookout for a Time Lord criminal who was awaiting trial for stealing during the Feast of Rassilon. He was found and dragged towards the room in which they kept the angel. Rassilon left the room and turned off the lights. He was almost testing the angel, as if it could also be utilised like how he utilised the Gorgon. Rassilon re-entered the room, and the man was gone. The angel's job was done, and she was feasting on the criminal's life. It would stop the pain for a while, but it would always return, and so would her screams. That was her first, and as of now, only feast, spending the rest of her days trying to fight her natural instincts and try to die. The solitude would help her do so. Only surrounded by the dead, perhaps it was a fitting fate, she thought to herself as she continued her story within her mind. The child beside her began to cry, while looking around at the other graves. Unbeknownst to the angel, there was another angel in that graveyard. Rassilon saw the angel as more of a danger rather than a resource he could exploit, and thus he stuck to the Gorgon as his main source of punishment. It was then that Rassilon decreed that all disgraced Time Lords would meet the same fate as her, discussing the concept with the High Council. In his time, he would come up with more and more cruel punishments for Time Lords that disobeyed him, such as her. Punishments that would overshadow the one that she continues to suffer from. Her image would be used as a means of silencing his opponents, 2 hands placed in front of one's face. She knew that she was the example that would instill fear into future generations, that her legend would be used as a frightful tale to scare children, and that the Time Lords in the future would forever fear the Weeping Angel. And now she stands, looking at the Citadel, a familiar child by her side who came to visit her, her only friend. A lonely Pridonian who visited the graveyard to cry. The angel would almost comfort them in a way, an angel to cry with. The angel also took it as a comfort as they restrained themselves from feasting on the child's life. The angel couldn't resist for much longer, but couldn't warn the child to stay away. She begged and she begged, but the begging remained within her thoughts, never to be heard by the outside world. With each blink from the child, her natural instinct gradually took over. To be a lonely assassin. It was her destiny. As Pasithi began to hide behind the murky clouds, her only friend began to reach out to her, and with that his fate was sealed, and he was no more. Vanishing into the night as if he never existed, disappearing into another time. An act of kindness from the child, and in turn that child's kindness was reciprocated by the angel. The life that the angel could never live was now given to her only friend, a life that the angel would feast on until the day of the child's death. Unable to shed a tear or even express her pain, the angel found herself unwillingly fixated on the Citadel once again. Behind her, another disgraced Time Lord stood silently screaming behind her hands, unable to articulate what they wanted to do, as an old man walked up towards the mountain with his granddaughter. The man walked towards the statues among the gravestones and turned them towards each other without blinking, and neither of the angels attacked the old man nor his granddaughter. The old man held his child's hand, and they walked towards the horizon, only turning around once to look at the angels. Old friends reunited, forever destined to feed on the lives they could no longer have, the lives that they were destined to cling on to as they were locked in an eternal stalemate, their eyes forever locked until the end of time. That is the curse of the lonely assassin. Immortality always comes at a cost. The curse of losing who you are, no longer being able to see the beauty within the universe, repeating the same day again and again, outliving the ones you love and growing to miss the ones you once hated. Forever lonely, forever weeping.